Rome did not want Cleopatra dead. It wanted her alive, broken, and dragged through the streets as proof that even gods could be humiliated. But in the shadows of her palace, far from Roman records, ancient rituals awakened, rites meant for queens facing the unthinkable. What followed was not a love story, not a poetic suicide, but a calculated act of defiance history tried to bury. Because Cleopatra's final days were not tragic. They were terrifying. The queen who refused to be paraded, they did not come to kill her. They came to keep her breathing. Because Rome wanted more than blood. It wanted humiliation preserved for eternity. The summer heat of Alexandria pressed against the stone walls of the palace like a living thing. Inside, silence ruled, broken only by distant boots and the faint echo of Roman orders carried on the wind. Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, sat alone in a chamber that once hosted philosophers, lovers, and gods. Now it felt like a waiting room for history's executioner. The banners of Egypt still hung, but they meant nothing. Outside those walls, Rome had already decided her future. Cleopatra had survived poison, betrayal, exile, and war. She had outlived Caesar. She had gambled everything on Antony and lost. Alexandria had fallen not in flames, but in submission. Roman standards replaced Egyptian guards. The city did not scream. It surrendered. That silence terrified her more than chaos ever could. Because silence meant control, and control meant Rome was planning something far worse than death. The Romans did not rush her. That was the cruelty. She was allowed to eat, to bathe, to sleep under watch. Every movement recorded. Every word noted. Cleopatra understood Roman spectacle well. She had seen conquered kings dragged through streets in chains, mocked by crowds before being quietly strangled. But she was not a king. She was a queen. And worse, she was a symbol. Egypt personified. Rome could not simply kill a symbol. It had to be broken publicly. Messengers arrived with polite language and sharpened meaning. She was informed that she would be protected until arrangements were finalized. Protected for transport. Cleopatra knew exactly what that meant. Rome was not planning a trial. It was planning a parade. A triumph. She would be shipped across the sea, placed in golden chains, and walked through Roman streets while citizens cheered the death of an empire disguised as a woman. In another wing of the city, Octavian waited patiently. He never raised his voice. He never threatened. His power lay in inevitability. Octavian understood fear better than rage. Rage could inspire rebellion. Fear created obedience. He ordered that Cleopatra be kept alive at all costs. Any soldier who harmed her would be executed, not because she mattered, but because her suffering had to be preserved intact. Cleopatra began to feel the walls closing in, not physically, but spiritually. In Egypt, queens were not merely rulers. They were living vessels of divine order. The pharaoh was bound to map the balance of the universe. To be captured, displayed, and mocked by foreigners was not just personal shame. It was cosmic disorder. Ancient laws, older than any Roman Senate, whispered their warnings through memory and blood. Priests who still dared approach her spoke carefully. Not everything was said aloud. Some truths were too dangerous for Roman ears. They reminded her of old traditions recorded in temple walls, in forbidden scrolls, rituals designed for moments when the world collapsed, when a queen faced the unthinkable. These were not ceremonies of romance or escape. They were acts of belief sharpened into weapons. Cleopatra listened without reacting. Her face remained calm, her posture regal. But inside, fear and calculation wrestled endlessly. Rome controlled her body. But did it control her fate? Each night, she imagined the Roman crowd, the laughter, the chains cutting into her skin. She imagined Egypt watching from afar, powerless. And she understood the true horror of her situation. Death would have been mercy. Rome had chosen something else. And as the palace torches burned lower, Cleopatra began to prepare not for surrender, but for a final defiance that history would later soften into myth, because the truth was far too disturbing to preserve. The chamber Rome never recorded, beneath the palace lay rooms even conquerors feared, not because they were guarded, but because they were remembered. Some doors were never meant to open. Some truths were never meant to survive victory. Night in Alexandria no longer brought rest. It brought movement. Beneath torchlight softened with cloth to hide its glow, Cleopatra was guided through corridors the Romans had not yet mapped. These passages predated the Ptolemies, carved when Egypt still spoke only to its gods. The walls were etched with symbols worn smooth by centuries of hands that had touched them in desperation. Cleopatra VII understood immediately why these chambers were absent from Roman reports. They were not political spaces. They were spiritual last resorts. The priests who led her spoke in fragments, careful and indirect. Rome listened everywhere now. But belief had its own language. They reminded her that Egypt had survived conquest before by Assyrians, Persians, Greeks. Each time, rituals were performed to preserve divine order when rulers were humiliated or removed. These were not ceremonies of hope. They were acknowledgments of collapse, designed to contain disgrace before it poisoned the land itself. Cleopatra's fear deepened, not eased. She had expected plans of escape, hidden ships, foreign alliances. Instead, she was being shown walls stained by incense and something darker. Stone basins carved with protective spells. Niches where offerings once rotted into dust. This chamber was not about saving a queen. It was about controlling the meaning of her end. In Roman thinking, defeat was political. In Egyptian belief, defeat was cosmic. If Cleopatra were paraded in chains, mocked by foreign crowds, Egypt's divine image would fracture. A queen reduced to entertainment would stain Mat itself. The priests believed such a wound could echo for generations famine, chaos, forgotten gods. That fear was older than Rome, older than Alexandria. Above them, the palace buzzed with Roman discipline. Guards rotated shifts. Scribes documented inventory, prisoners, valuables. Cleopatra's name appeared constantly in Octavian's correspondence, always paired with one word: alive. Octavian understood spectacle better than anyone. He knew that killing Cleopatra would end the story. Displaying her would rewrite it. Rome would not just conquer Egypt, it would humiliate its gods. The priests explained the unspoken choice. There existed a final rite reserved only for queens facing capture. It was not suicide in the way later ages would understand it. It was a controlled crossing, bound by rules, timing, and belief. Done incorrectly, it condemned both ruler and land. Done correctly, it preserved dignity while denying the conqueror his prize. This was why the ritual was hidden. Rome could conquer cities, but it could not conquer meaning. Cleopatra felt the weight of generations pressing down on her spine. She was no longer only a woman facing fear. She was the last hinge between Egypt's past and an uncertain future. Every breath she took was borrowed time, granted by Roman strategy. Every hour alive tightened the trap. The longer she lived, the more complete Rome's victory would become. When she returned to her chambers, nothing appeared different. Roman guards bowed politely. Food was served. Water poured. But Cleopatra had changed. Knowledge is heavier than chains. She now understood that survival itself had become a weapon turned against her. Rome believed it owned her body. Egypt still claimed her soul. And somewhere between those two powers, Cleopatra began to calculate which ending would wound her enemies, the most knowing that once the ritual path was chosen, there would be no turning back. The price of being a goddess, to rule Egypt, a queen had to become more than human. But divinity was never protection. It was a contract written in blood, and Rome was about to collect. By dawn, the palace felt like a shrine built for someone already dead. Cleopatra moved through her rooms with deliberate calm, aware that every step was observed, every gesture interpreted. The Romans mistook this composure for surrender. They did not understand Egyptian power. In Egypt, a ruler did not merely command armies. She embodied the gods themselves. From the moment she was crowned, Cleopatra VII had been shaped into a living symbol of Isis Mother, protector, and divine authority woven into flesh. This belief was not decorative. It was law. Temple inscriptions made it clear. A divine queen who allowed herself to be publicly disgraced by foreigners threatened the balance of the world. The humiliation of a goddess was not personal shame. It was sacrilege with consequences. Ancient scribes warned of droughts, unrest, and spiritual decay following such events. Cleopatra had once used this belief to strengthen her rule. Now it tightened around her like a noose. Roman officials delivered updates wrapped in courtesy. Arrangements were being finalized. Ships prepared. Timing discussed. No date announced another layer of cruelty. Uncertainty was a Roman tool. Cleopatra read between the words and felt the clock accelerating. Each delay allowed Octavian to ensure maximum impact. He wanted her alive, composed, recognizable. A queen reduced to a lesson. In private moments, Cleopatra wrestled with her identity. Was she still a goddess if Rome controlled her breath? Did divinity end at the edge of a chain? She remembered coronation rituals, the cold gold of the diadem, the chants that declared her eternal. Those words were not poetry. They were obligations. To fail them was to betray Egypt itself. The priests returned discreetly, bringing fragments of forbidden texts. They spoke of queens before her names erased, endings distorted. History, they warned, would not be kind. Rome would reshape her story regardless. Love would replace strategy. Romance would soften terror. The truth would be buried because it was too uncomfortable. That belief, not passion, was driving her final calculations. Above them all loomed Octavian, methodical and detached. He had studied Cleopatra, not as a woman, but as a symbol to be dismantled. His advisors argued for immediate execution. He refused. Killing her would elevate her. Displaying her would reduce her to spectacle. Rome did not fear gods, it domesticated them. Cleopatra sensed the trap closing. Roman guards became more numerous. Doors stayed open. Privacy vanished. This was not negligence. It was preparation. The world was being arranged so that when she finally left Egypt, nothing would interrupt the performance. In the silence before night, Cleopatra stood before a statue of Isis and felt the crushing contradiction of power. She had ruled empires, negotiated with legends, commanded loyalty with a glance. And yet, belief demanded more from her now than politics ever had. To remain divine, she might have to abandon life itself. To live, she would have to accept becoming ordinary, mocked, chained, rewritten. That was the price of being a goddess. Not immortality, but expectation. As the torches dimmed and the city slept under Roman order, Cleopatra made a decision that could not be reversed. She would not allow Rome to define her ending. Whatever form it took, it would be chosen, not granted. And somewhere in the shadows of the palace, the final ritual began to move from memory into action. The ritual of no return, it was not chosen in desperation. It was prepared in obedience. What awaited her was not escape, but a crossing only queens were allowed to attempt. The final night settled over Alexandria like a held breath. Roman guards stood closer than ever, confident the trap was complete. Cleopatra's chambers glowed with lamplight and ritual order, a scene the Romans misread as indulgence before transport. They did not understand that ceremony, in Egypt, was not comfort. It was instruction. Cleopatra VII moved deliberately, guided by rules older than the empire that now surrounded her. The priests had warned her. This rite was not gentle. Later generations would soften it into poetry and symbols, but the truth was harsher. Ancient texts described a sequence meant to sever a queen from humiliation, not from pain. The ritual demanded clarity of mind, timing aligned with belief and absolute resolve. Any doubt would corrupt its purpose. This was why it was reserved for moments when capture threatened the divine order itself. Cleopatra bathed and dressed not as a prisoner, but as Isis reborn. Each ornament carried meaning: gold for eternity, linen for purity, oils to mark the body as sacred rather than owned. The Romans allowed it, amused by what they thought was vanity. They did not see the preparation for refusal. They saw compliance. That blindness was their final mistake. Outside the chamber, Octavian waited for confirmation that the queen was ready to be moved at dawn. Octavian believed time was on his side. He believed surveillance guaranteed obedience. He had underestimated belief's ability to operate quietly beneath power. Rome controlled doors and guards. It did not control meaning. The ritual text spoke of a final offering and act meant to confuse conquerors and protect the land from spiritual contamination. It was never about painless death. It was about denying the enemy the right to define the ending. Cleopatra understood the cost. There would be fear, there would be suffering, but there would also be authorship. Attendants were dismissed, doors closed. The room fell silent except for breath and flame. Cleopatra did not pray for rescue. She prayed for alignment, to the gods who demanded balance, to the ancestors who had faced similar moments and chosen dignity over display. The ritual required solitude, not witnesses. Rome would not be allowed to observe, interpret, or claim this moment. What followed would later be romanticized, reduced to a symbol easy for foreign audiences to digest. The truth was more unsettling. The rite was calculated, controlled, and terrifying. It demanded presence in suffering, not escape from it. Cleopatra faced it without illusion. This was the price of refusing to become a Roman spectacle. As the ritual progressed, the palace above remained unaware. Guards stood ready. Orders were prepared. Rome was moments away from securing its prize. The irony was absolute. At the height of Roman control, its victory was already slipping beyond reach. Cleopatra's final thoughts were not of Antony or lost power. They were of Egypt, of preserving a boundary Rome could not cross. If she could not save her throne, she would save the meaning of it. History would struggle to explain this choice because it terrified empires to admit that belief could outmaneuver force. By the time the lamps burned low, the point of no return had been crossed. The ritual had done what it was meant to do. And when Rome finally came to collect its living trophy, it would find only silence, an ending it could not parade, rewrite, or fully understand. What history was afraid to admit, they would call it romance. They would call it pride. But the truth was colder and far more terrifying. When the Romans finally entered the chamber, victory collapsed into confusion. There was no resistance, no dramatic struggle, no living queen to be escorted into history's spotlight. Cleopatra VII lay arranged with deliberate care, dressed not as a defeated ruler, but as a sacred figure completing a final obligation. The silence unsettled the soldiers more than any scream could have. Rome had planned for chains, not stillness. It had prepared for spectacle, not refusal. Reports were rushed to Octavian. His reaction was not rage. It was calculation. That triumph had been stolen. A dead queen could not be paraded. A dead goddess could not be humiliated. What remained was damage control. Rome needed a story, one that would dull the sharp edge of what had just happened. So the truth began to soften almost immediately. The official narrative emerged carefully shaped. A tragic love story. A dramatic suicide. A queen overcome by emotion. Anything except the real explanation, that Cleopatra's final act was strategic, religious, and deliberate. Rome could conquer territory, but it could not conquer belief without admitting it feared it. And fear was something empires never confessed. Ancient writers hesitated. Some hinted at rituals. Others avoided detail altogether. Archaeology would later reveal inconsistencies, chambers unlisted, texts altered, records incomplete. The absence spoke louder than any inscription. Something had happened in those final hours that Rome did not want preserved accurately. Something that suggested power had limits. Cleopatra's death ended more than a dynasty. It ended the last serious challenge to Rome's authority over meaning itself. Egypt became a province. Its gods were absorbed, renamed, repackaged. The rituals once reserved for queens vanished into fragments and footnotes. What could not be erased was the discomfort left behind, the knowledge that a woman, cornered by the greatest empire of her age, had denied it the ending it wanted. History prefers clean conclusions. Lovers reunited in death, tyrants punished, heroes rewarded. Cleopatra's final days refuse such simplicity. They reveal a harsher truth, that civilizations often hide the moments when belief outmaneuvers force, because those moments expose vulnerability at the heart of power. The Romans won Egypt. They won wealth, grain, prestige. But they did not win Cleopatra. They did not get their parade. They did not get their warning display. What they received instead was silence, and silence is difficult to dominate. Centuries later, her story is still debated, still softened, still romanticized. Not because historians lack evidence, but because the full truth is unsettling. It suggests that even at the end, stripped of armies and allies, an individual can still choose how power remembers them. That choice terrifies empires more than rebellion ever could. Cleopatra's final act was not escape. It was containment. A boundary drawn where Rome believed none existed. And in that boundary lies a dark reflection on humanity itself, that we build empires to control bodies, lands, and stories, yet remain deeply afraid of those who choose meaning over survival.